The first time I saw the cave's sunlight was sliding down the sandstone like liquid fire. The air was still the kind of silence that makes you hear your own heartbeat. Just inside the entrance, a single rock hammer lay where it had fallen, its leather grip worn smooth by years of use. I remember the glint of that steel under my flashlight, scratched dulled but still firm in the hand that once swung it against stone. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from, and tap subscribe if you believe some names should never fade. I live a few towns north of the Swell, in a small place called Green River, population just under 1,000. It's a quiet stretch of Utah desert, one gas station, one diner, and a sky so wide you could drown in it. After I retired from the Park Service, I started keeping record stories of folks who'd gone missing out there. You do that long enough, and every gust of wind through a canyon starts to sound like a voice calling from the past. Back in 2012, life moved at a steady rhythm. I'd spend mornings walking the river trail before the heat kicked up, then help the county museum catalog old mining maps. The air carried that crisp, late October bite, 60 degrees by noon, dipping to the 40s at night. The cottonwoods were turning gold, and the smell of wood smoke drifted from chimneys across town. Nobody expected much to change in a place like this. That fall, I crossed paths with a man who noticed things most people overlooked. Dr. James Chen wasn't a local, but he loved this country more than most born to it. Every year or so, he'd roll into town in his dusty white pickup windows streaked with red dust back seat piled with topo maps and rock samples. He'd stop by the cafe, order black coffee and eggs over easy, then ask about road conditions, which washes had flooded, which trails were still clear. He wasn't loud or boastful. If anything, he blended into the scenery, khaki shirt, sun-bleached hat, calm voice. But when he talked about the desert, it was like listening to a man describe an old friend. He'd trace lines across a map with his finger, explaining how the earth folded and cracked millions of years ago, how the color of the stone told a story if you knew how to read it. The folks at the cafe liked him. The waitresses joked that he tipped like a man trying to make up for eating alone. Even the sheriff, Mark Sullivan, respected him, said he wished more hikers were like Dr. Chen, cautious, organized, never cutting corners. His sister Lisa came through town once that spring. I remember because she looked out of place in her city clothes, dark jeans, a soft scarf despite the heat. She was proud of her brother, but worried about him too. Over lunch, she told me James is careful, but the desert doesn't care how careful you are. I remember thinking she sounded older than her years, someone used to waiting for phone calls that came late or not at all. By mid-October, James had wrapped up his semester lectures and told Dr. Reeves he was heading into the field for a week, just him, a GPS, and a stretch of the San Rafael swell he'd been charting for years. It wasn't unusual. Field work was his sanctuary, his way of clearing the noise. He left detailed notes with the department maps, estimated routes, expected return date, the kind of planning only experience teaches. The swell in autumn is deceptive. Mornings are cool, the air thin and dry, and the red rock glows like embers. But after a rain, that same rock turns treacherous, soft, heavy, unstable. The locals know it. You stay clear of cliffs for a few days after the storms pass. That October had seen more rain than usual. The washes were swollen, and I remember one afternoon standing by the ridge and watching a thin ribbon of water snake down the sandstone. Beautiful, but dangerous. James didn't mind solitude. Out there you can go hours, sometimes days, without seeing another person. He thrived on it. To him, the silence wasn't loneliness. It was focus. I'd seen him hike with a small pack and a leather-handled hammer at his belt, tapping at stone layers with the precision of a surgeon. He once told me every rock out here has a memory. You just have to listen long enough. The weekend before he left, I ran into him at the gas station. He was topping off his truck, talking about a new formation he wanted to photograph. Nothing risky. He said, smiling, "Just something I want to check before winter." He mentioned camping near the same flat he'd used before, 4 miles from the trailhead tucked against a bluff. I told him to keep an eye on the weather. He promised he would. That was the last time I saw him. The next week rolled on like any other. School buses passed at dawn, church bells rang on Sunday, and the sun kept rising clean and hot over the desert. But I remember a night toward the end of that week, October 17th. The air had that strange stillness after rain, the kind that makes dogs restless. I'd been sitting on my porch, coffee in hand, when thunder rumbled somewhere far off, deep enough to shake the glass in the windows. Out toward the swell, a faint flash lit the horizon, followed by a sound like shifting gravel. Rock slide, I thought. It happens. Out there, the land changes shape in the dark, and nobody hears it but the coyotes. By Monday, folks at the university were expecting James back. When he didn't show, no one panicked fieldwork often ran a day or two long. Still, Dr. Reeves mentioned later that she felt something was off. He hadn't sent his usual back-safe email, and his phone went straight to voicemail. She called Lisa that evening just in case. Lisa brushed it off at first. Her brother was reliable, but he wasn't tethered to his phone. Tuesday came and went. By Wednesday, the department secretary had filed a missing person notice. Sheriff Sullivan called me for advice on terrain access. I'd mapped those canyons for years. I told him about the flat James liked to camp on, about the side trails he'd taken before. The sheriff said they'd start a search at dawn. That night, a cold wind moved in from the west. Dust swept through town, whispering along fences, rattling the loose tin on the old service station roof. I remember locking up the museum and standing for a while on Main Street, the lights of the diner glowing warm through the windows. Somewhere out there, James was supposed to be driving home, his truck tires humming over asphalt headlights, cutting through the dark. But he didn't. Out beyond the ridge, the desert had gone quiet again, too quiet even for October. And though no one knew it yet, that stillness was the sound of something sealed away, waiting 12 long years to be found. By the time the third day passed without word from James, the desert didn't feel like the same place anymore. You could sense it in town, the way folks spoke softer, as if noise might make the silence worse. Sheriff Sullivan called me early that morning. His voice was steady, but I could hear the weight behind it. "Dan," he said, "we've got a professor missing out in the swell. Left his camp, set up trucks still at the trailhead. You know that country better than most mind. Riding along, I didn't even have to think about it. I packed water, a map, and my old binoculars, and by sunrise we were rolling south on Highway 24, the world turning from gold to rust as the day came on. When we reached the trailhead, I saw his truck parked in the dust like it had been waiting for him to return. White paint dulled by sun, Utah plates half buried in sand windshield speckled with dried rain. The sheriff leaned on the hood and looked at me. "Still locked?" I asked. He shook his head. "Nope. Keys were in the tent." That tent sat about 4 miles out, tucked near a sandstone bluff that looked like a frozen wave. It took us the better part of an hour to hike there, soft sand, loose rock, the kind of terrain that eats up daylight. When we reached his camp, I stopped short. Everything was in order. His sleeping bag still laid out, his cooking pot half full of spoiled pasta. A mug sitting upright beside it, dust settled inside. The scene felt paused, like he'd stepped away to stretch his legs and never came back. The sheriff crouched by the fire pit, ran a finger through the ash. "Looks like he cooked that meal maybe 2-3 days before the rains," he said. "No footprints left around it. Storm wiped 'em clean." I moved closer to the tent, careful not to disturb anything. Inside his jacket hung neatly from a line. A folded map sat near his cot, open to a section of the swell marked with a red circle, handwritten notes about formations and stratolines. I'd seen those notes before. James was precise, always chasing the shape of the earth like it was a puzzle only he could solve. Search and rescue arrived that afternoon. Helicopters from Salt Lake came in low, their blades thumping against the canyon walls. By dusk, there were 10 of us working the area, deputies, volunteers, climbers, who knew the canyons better than some maps. We swept a 5-mile radius that first night, calling his name into the wind, listening for anything that might answer back. All we heard were echoes. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and every one of us froze, hoping the next sound might be human. It wasn't. Over the next 3 days, we expanded the search drones, dogs, everything we could think of. The rains had done more damage than we realized. Entire ledges had given way, boulders the size of trucks had shifted and tumbled down slopes, leaving behind raw scars of pale stone. The desert was unstable, restless. The dogs picked up faint traces of human scent near a wash, but lost it halfway down the slope, probably from runoff. The air was too dry, too thin for scent to linger long. By the second week, fatigue had set in. We'd covered nearly 10 miles in every direction, climbing ledges, scanning gullies, lowering ourselves into slots so narrow we had to turn sideways to pass. Every night we'd regroup at the trailhead, our boots caked in dust, faces raw from wind. The sheriff would mark off another section on his map, shake his head and say, "Tomorrow we'll move east." But deep down, we all knew what that meant. In country like this, move east was just another way of saying we hadn't found him yet, and maybe we never would. Lisa arrived that weekend. I met her at the motel near the interstate tiny place with faded carpet and a neon sign that buzzed like an insect. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. I told her we were doing everything we could, but she only nodded, clutching a photo of her brother. "He's been out there so many times," she said softly. "He knows how to handle himself." I wanted to believe her, but I'd spent my life watching experienced men underestimate this land. It doesn't hate you. It just doesn't care whether you make it back. We took her to the command post the next morning. She spoke with the sheriff, looked over the maps, asked questions that had no good answers. When we reached his camp again, she stood for a long time beside his tent, tracing the shape of his handwriting on the map. He always drew circles like that, she said, almost to herself. Then she crouched, ran her fingers through the sand and whispered, "Please come home." None of us spoke. Sometimes silence feels like respect. By the end of the 3rd week, we'd exhausted nearly every lead. Helicopters had flown so many passes that their fuel drums were running low. The university sent another team of volunteers. They searched the eastern ridges, then the dry canyons below. Nothing. No footprints, no discarded gear, no sign of a fall. Just sandstone and wind and a silence that grew heavier each day. When the official search was suspended, it hit Lisa hard. She stood beside the sheriff's truck, hands jammed into her jacket pockets, and said quietly, "I can't leave until I've looked myself." The sheriff nodded. "Then we'll make sure you get a guide." That guide was me. Over the next few days, I took her into the canyons, careful not to push too far. We hiked until the heat shimmered against the stone, stopping now and then to rest in the shade. She carried one of her brother's old field notebooks, thumbing through pages filled with sketches of rock layers, little notes about grain texture, color shifts. "He'd want to be out here forever," she said once, looking up at the cliffs. "He used to call these places cathedrals." Her voice cracked on the last word. I didn't try to comfort her. Out here, words feel small. After she returned home to California, the town slipped back into its old rhythm, but something in it had changed. Every hiker who passed through Green River asked about the missing professor. Locals would point toward the horizon, say, "somewhere out that way," and then fall quiet. The university held a memorial in January, photos, soft music, a scholarship fund in his name. It was kind, well-meaning, but I remember standing in the back of that room and thinking how wrong it felt to call it closure. You can't close a story that never had an ending. Winter came hard that year. Snow dusted the mesas and the desert froze in silence. I spent those months filing reports, updating maps, trying to convince myself we'd done everything possible. But every so often I'd drive South Park near the same trailhead and just sit there listening to the wind. Once I walked out to the bluff where his camp had been. The tent was gone cleared by the department, but the outline of its base was still visible, a faint rectangle pressed into the sand. I knelt there, ran my hand along the earth, and thought about how close he might have been, how narrow the line can be between exploration and tragedy. The official case remained open, but after a few years, the calls stopped. The world moves on. Students graduated, colleagues retired, and James's name became a story told over coffee, one of those mysteries that never finds an answer. But for me, it never sat right. The search reports mentioned several fresh rock slides during that same week in October, the kind caused by sudden heavy rain. Most had been cleared or mapped by now, but a few sections were still unstable, sealed off. I remember asking the sheriff once, "What if one of those slides hid something?" He shrugged. "Could be, but we're not digging through every cliff face in the swell." He wasn't wrong. The desert covers its secrets well. Still, every time I looked at those maps, my eyes returned to that red circle James had drawn, the one near the eastern ridge, maybe 6 miles from camp. He'd labeled it Navajo cross-bedding possible cave formation. I'd seen him write notes like that before. It meant he'd found something worth studying. I mentioned it to Dr. Reeves once when she visited the area a few years later. She sighed and said, "He was always chasing patterns. The trouble with patterns is they don't stop at the surface." For 12 years, that note sat in my mind like a stone I couldn't move. Sometimes when tourists asked about dangerous spots in the swell, I'd think about that circle and wonder if we'd walked right past him. If the rain that night had shifted just enough rock to seal the entrance to wherever he was working. It's a thought you learn to live with, but you never quite let it go. Then, one August afternoon in 2024, the phone rang again. It was the sheriff, older, now long retired, but still sharp. "Dan," he said, "you're not going to believe this. 3 hikers found a sealed cave up near your professor's old grid. There's a name carved on the handle of a rock hammer inside." He paused, let the words hang there. James Chen. The world seemed to tilt just a little. For 12 years we'd searched the open country, and all along he'd been there trapped behind stone, waiting to be found. I didn't say much, just sat there listening to the hum on the line, thinking about that night of rain, about the thunder rolling across the canyons, about how close we'd been and how far. The sheriff finally said, "They're heading out to open the site tomorrow morning. You might want to be there." I told him I would. Then I hung up the phone, turned toward the window, and watched the last light fall over the red cliffs in the distance. Somewhere out there, the desert was about to give up one of its secrets, and after 12 long years, I was finally ready to listen. The next morning, I drove south before sunrise. The highway was empty, the world tinted in that pale blue light that makes the desert look like the surface of another planet. By the time I turned off onto the old dirt road leading toward the swell, the first rescue trucks were already there. County vehicles, a forensic van, and 3 hikers standing off to the side, their faces drawn tight with the kind of shock that comes from realizing you've stumbled across someone's grave. The air smelled like rain and dust, a faint sweetness from sagebrush crushed under tires. Sheriff Sullivan was leaning on the hood of his truck, hands in his pockets, nodding toward the canyon. "They found it about 6 miles in," he said. "Rockfall sealed a small cave. You'll want to see it for yourself." We hiked single file along the wash, the sandstone walls rising higher the deeper we went. The hikers. Ryan, Melissa, and Derek walked quietly, answering questions in short sentences. Melissa said she'd noticed the rock face looked wrong, too smooth in color, as if it hadn't aged like the rest. They thought it was a small collapse at first, until Derek spotted a gap between 2 boulders just wide enough to shine a flashlight through. "We saw the backpack first," she told me. Then something that didn't look right behind it. She didn't say the word body, and I didn't ask her to. When we reached the site, a hush settled over everyone. The canyon widened slightly, their sunlight spilling down one side like molten copper. The rockfall was about 10 feet high, piled in an uneven slope, the stones red and tan with streaks of white. You could see where the rescue crew had already started removing rock careful work, slow and deliberate so they wouldn't trigger another collapse. One of the deputies pointed to a narrow gap near the base. "That's where they first looked inside," he said. I crouched and peered through. The beam from my flashlight caught the faint outline of a blue pack, its straps stiff with dust, and beside it something pale curved still. By late afternoon, they had cleared enough debris to widen the entrance. The air that came out was cool and dry, like opening an old cellar. I went in with one of the investigators, careful where I stepped. The space was small, 15 feet deep, at most maybe 8 across. The walls were rough sandstone streaked with thin veins of lighter stone. It felt both intimate and endless, like standing inside time itself. Near the back wall, the remains rested against a pile of smaller rocks, knees drawn slightly up, hands near the lap. A headlamp lay beside him, the bulb dark, the strap brittle with age. I could see a hammer in one hand, the handle wrapped in worn leather. The name was still legible, James Chen. For a long moment, no one said a word. You could hear the quiet click of the camera shutter, the distant rustle of wind through the canyon above. The medical examiner moved carefully, recording every item: 2 empty water bottles, a small notebook sealed in a plastic bag, the GPS unit long dead, the remnants of an energy bar wrapper near his pack. 12 years gone, and yet it felt like he'd only just stepped away. I remember kneeling there looking at that hammer and thinking of all the times I'd seen him use it, tapping at stone like a man reading Braille. When the body was finally carried out under a gray canvas shroud, the sun had slipped behind the cliffs and the temperature dropped fast. The canyon that had looked so beautiful hours earlier now felt heavy, watchful. I stayed until the last of the equipment was loaded, then drove back toward town with the sheriff. He didn't talk much, just kept his eyes on the road. After a while, he said, "You know, Dan, we searched that area more than once. Walked right past it." I nodded. "We didn't know what we were looking for," I said. He let out a slow breath. "Yeah. We were looking for a man on the ground, not one trapped behind it." 2 days later, the medical examiner confirmed the identity. The condition of the remains matched what we'd seen in the cave dehydration-exhaustion exposure. They ruled it accidental. Lisa flew in the following week. When she walked into the sheriff's office, she carried herself with a strange mix of calm and disbelief. "I thought this day would feel different," she told me quietly, "but it just feels still." I took her out to the canyon 2 days later after the site had been cleared and stabilized. She stood at the entrance, the plaque markers still fresh in the sand, and she didn't cry. Instead, she knelt down, touched the stone, and whispered, "He was right here." There wasn't anything to add to that. The notebook he'd left behind was still being examined, but the sheriff let me read a few copied pages. His handwriting started steady, precise, like field notes, observations about the cave formation, the sandstone layers, moisture patterns. Then halfway down the page, the tone changed. Words slanted. The ink pressed deeper into the paper. He described the collapse, how the entrance sealed behind him, how he'd started to dig using the hammer and his hands. The details were exact, measured like a man still trying to control the chaos. 2 bottles of water, he'd written. About 1.5 liters total, enough for a day, if careful. I remember setting that page down and staring at the lines until they blurred. I could picture him in that small chamber hearing the rocks shift, realizing what had happened, refusing to panic. That was James logical even in crisis. Another entry spoke of his hands torn from moving stone, wrapping them with pieces of his shirt. He noted the airflow, how it seemed to cool at night, warm in the morning, meaning there was still space somewhere near the entrance. Maybe 2 or 3 feet, he'd written. Can feel faint air movement. He was right. When we measured the thickness of the rock seal, it was just under 3 feet. He'd been that close. Reading those notes, I couldn't help but think how many times we'd passed over that same area during the 2012 search. The sheriff had marked it on our maps back then, but the fresh rock slide made it look like solid ground. No one thought to look inside. We'd been standing just above him calling his name while he was still alive, hammering at the wall. That thought still wakes me some nights. In the weeks that followed, the news spread fast. Reporters came through town crews from Salt Lake, Denver, even one from Los Angeles. They wanted sound bites, quotes, the tragic headline. But for those of us who knew him, the story wasn't about tragedy, it was about luck, the kind that turns bad in a heartbeat. Dr. Reeves gave a statement to the press. She said James had been one of the most methodical researchers she'd ever known, that his only mistake was leaving his beacon at camp. He trusted his own discipline, she told them. And discipline can't always beat chance. After the noise died down, I went back out there one more time. It was early evening again, the same hour they'd found him. The canyon was quiet except for the sound of wind brushing through the rocks. I walked to the cave, which was now sealed off with a low barrier and a small bronze plaque. It read simply, Dr. James Chen, 1967-2012, geologist, teacher, explorer. Someone had left a small hammer beside it wrapped in blue cloth. I sat there for a long while watching the shadows crawl up the wall as the sun went down. Later that night, I met with Sheriff Sullivan and one of the newer deputies at the cafe. We talked about how the case might have gone differently, whether technology could have saved him, whether the search could have been run another way. If he'd had a satellite communicator on him, the sheriff said, stirring his coffee, we could have had boots on the ground within hours. The deputy nodded. The university's changing their rules now. Mandatory check-ins, GPS logs, all of it. It felt good to hear, even if it was 12 years too late. Lisa stayed in town long enough to attend the new memorial service at the university. She asked me to sit with her during it. I remember the way she held her brother's rock hammer in her lap, the handle polished from use. Afterward, she told me she was taking it home to San Francisco, that it belonged where he'd grown up beside a photo from his grad school days. It's strange, she said, to think of him spending his last hours trying to move rock, but that's who he was. He never stopped working. When she left, the town felt quiet again. The swell was the same as it had always been, red, vast, indifferent. But now, every time I walk those canyons, I see them differently. The stone doesn't just hold history, it hides it. It took 12 years for the desert to give him back, and in that time it taught me something I still can't quite name. Maybe it's the patience of the land, or the stubbornness of memory. Or maybe it's just that the earth keeps its own kind of silence, a silence that only breaks when it's ready. A few weeks after the recovery, a crew from the Geological Survey came through to document the site. One of them called me over, said they'd found faint marks on the outer boulders, tiny chips and scratches made from inside. They matched the head of James's hammer exactly. The pattern showed he'd worked his way within inches of daylight before exhaustion stopped him. I stood there looking at those marks, running my fingers across them. They were shallow, uneven, almost desperate. But they were proof of something powerful he didn't quit. Even in the dark, dehydrated, with the odds long gone, he kept fighting for air, for light, for another swing. When the crew packed up and drove off, I stayed behind. The last of the daylight was fading, and the wind had started again, whispering through the cracks. I could almost hear the echo of his hammer, faint and far, like a heartbeat under stone. And as I stood there, I realized this wasn't just the end of a mystery. It was the beginning of understanding what it means to keep trying, even when the world has already gone quiet around you. That night I drove home under a moon that looked like polished bone. The highway stretched straight and empty, the kind of road where thoughts outnumber the miles. I didn't turn on the radio. The only sound was the hum of the tires and the desert wind slipping through the open vent. Somewhere out there, the canyon waited in silence, and I knew this story wasn't done, not yet. The desert had one more thing to say before it let him rest. I didn't sleep much after that night on the highway. The sound of the tires on asphalt had stayed with me long after I parked humming somewhere behind my ribs. By morning, I found myself driving back toward the canyon again, not because there was anything new to see, but because the silence out there had a way of answering questions no one else could. The air was cool, the sky pale as bone. A pair of hawks circled above the cliffs, and for a moment I thought about how this same stretch of desert had swallowed a man whole for 12 years, then quietly handed him back like it was never his fault to begin with. When I reached the site, the equipment was gone. The investigation had been wrapped up, officially labeled an accident case closed, but something in me needed to see it once more without the noise of cameras or questions. The cave opening had been resealed, stabilized, marked off with a temporary wooden frame until the permanent plaque could be installed. I stood there for a long time watching sunlight crawl across the rock face. From that angle, you couldn't tell anything had ever happened there, just another patch of sandstone scarred by time and rain. But I knew what was beneath it: 3 feet of rock, a man's determination, and a story that would outlast all of us. The next few weeks blurred together. There were interviews, phone calls, the usual process of turning a tragedy into a report. Still, I couldn't shake the words I'd read in James's notebook. The last few lines haunted me, written in handwriting that had grown faint and unsteady. Still trying. Can't. Those words weren't resignation. They were effort, the final breath of someone refusing to quit. I'd seen plenty of death in my career, but this one felt different. It wasn't violence that took him, it was bad luck, the slow cruelty of time and stone. When the medical examiner's report came back, the details matched what we already suspected: dehydration, exhaustion, exposure. He'd fought until his body couldn't fight anymore. The hammer found beside him was scarred from use, fresh scratches still visible under the dust. Forensics confirmed what we saw: he'd been within 3 feet of the surface. The thought of that so close to air to light cut deeper than any theory of what might have been. A few days later, Lisa asked if I'd go with her to the site one last time before she flew home. We drove out early, the sun still low enough to cast long shadows across the land. She was quiet most of the drive, just watching the horizon roll by. When we reached the canyon, she walked ahead of me, carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth. She stopped near the cave, unwrapped it, and placed a photograph against the rock, one of her and her brother as kids, standing in front of their parents' restaurant. Her hand lingered on the stone, as if waiting for a pulse. He was always the patient one, she said softly, even as a boy. He could spend hours just staring at the ground, studying ants or the cracks in the sidewalk. He saw details the rest of us missed. We stayed until the wind picked up and started carrying sand across the wash. Before we left, she took a small piece of sandstone from the base of the bluff, the same color as the rock her brother had studied. She said she'd keep it on her desk, something solid, something that didn't fade. Watching her walk back toward the car, I thought about how strange closure can be. You think it's a single moment, a discovery, a confession, a body, but it's never that clean. It's a slow gathering of small truths until the weight of them finally lets you rest. Back in town, the university announced new safety protocols for field researchers. Every professor, every graduate student would now carry satellite communicators at all times, check in twice daily, file precise GPS coordinates before heading out. The policy bore his name unofficially. Everyone called it the Chen Rule. It was meant to save others from the same fate, but for me it was something quieter, a way to honor a man who had done everything right and still paid the price. I remember talking with Dr. Reeves about it not long after. We met at the same cafe James used to visit when he came through town. The same corner booth, same chipped coffee mugs. She looked older than when I'd last seen her, grief and age working in the same slow rhythm. He taught me something, she said after a while. Not about geology, but about humility. You can prepare for everything, plan every variable, and still the earth reminds you who's in charge. She paused, stirring her coffee, then looked up at me. He wasn't careless, Dan. He just believed in his work enough to keep going. That stayed with me. The word believed. You don't hear it much in science, but maybe you should. Belief isn't blind faith. It's a kind of quiet devotion, the kind that gets you up before dawn, drives you 6 miles into nowhere, and keeps you swinging a hammer in the dark. Later that month, the department held a second memorial service. This one felt different, less about grief, more about recognition. They'd recovered his remains, his notes, even his last words, and now they could finally say goodbye properly. The hall was full of students, faculty, and people who'd never even met him, but had followed the story. Lisa spoke near the end. She stood behind the podium, hands clasped around that same piece of sandstone. Her voice trembled once, but she never lost her footing. For 12 years we lived, not knowing, she said. Now we know he didn't quit. He tried to come home. And, in a way, he did. When the service ended, I stepped outside and found myself staring up at the Wasatch Mountains glowing orange in the evening light. I thought of the plaque they were planning to place at the site and the swell of hikers who'd pass by and never realize what that small bronze square meant. Maybe that was fitting. The desert keeps its lessons quiet. The story made its rounds in the months that followed, documentaries, newspaper features, even a short piece on public radio. They focused on the courage, the endurance, the science of it all. But what none of them could capture was the sound of that canyon at dusk, the way it swallows every noise, how the wind seems to pause just before dark, as if listening. Out there you can almost hear him. Not words exactly, but rhythm. The steady tap of metal against stone, patient and deliberate, the heartbeat of a man still working. The 3 hikers who found him stayed in touch with Lisa. They told her they were grateful to have been the ones to uncover the cave, though they still had nightmares about it sometimes. I spoke with them too. Ryan said he couldn't stop thinking about how ordinary it had looked, just another rockfall they might have walked past. "Makes you wonder how many more there are," he said. "Places like that, sealed up hiding stories we'll never find." He wasn't wrong. The desert is full of ghosts that don't know they're ghosts yet. As autumn returned, the geology department unveiled the final memorial plaque at the cave entrance. I went with Lisa, Dr. Reeves, and the sheriff. The hike in was slow, the air sharp with that clean desert dryness that always follows rain. The plaque was simple, his name the years a single line beneath. He loved these rocks. Someone had added a small engraving of a hammer beside it. Lisa ran her hand over the letters, then placed a sprig of sage at the base. No one spoke for a long while. Before we left, I looked up at the cliffs glowing under the afternoon sun. I thought about how somewhere behind that smooth wall of stone, a man had spent his last hours doing the same thing he'd done his entire life, studying the earth, trying to understand its patterns. There was something peaceful in that, even as it broke your heart. We started back toward the trailhead, our footsteps crunching softly in the sand. Halfway down, I turned to take one last look at the canyon. The wind had picked up again, stirring small spirals of dust that caught the light. For a moment, I thought I saw the glint of metal where the plaque stood, a quick flash before the sun dipped behind a ridge. It was probably nothing, just reflection, but it made me stop, because in that instant it looked like a signal. Not one of distress or regret, just acknowledgement. Like the desert itself saying, "I remember him too." That evening, as we drove back toward Green River, Lisa asked if I believed in luck. I thought about it before answering. "Not the kind people talk about," I said. "But I believe in moments, those little slivers of time where everything lines up just enough to make sense. Maybe finding him was one of those." She nodded, watching the horizon. The road stretched ahead of us in a long, unbroken line, the kind that makes you feel both small and infinite. By the time I dropped her at her hotel, night had settled across town. The air smelled like rain again. I sat in my truck for a while before heading home, listening to the distant rumble of thunder rolling off the mesas. It sounded almost like rock shifting under pressure, the kind of sound that reminds you how fragile every surface really is. I didn't know it then, but there was still one more thing waiting out there in the desert. Something small, almost overlooked, that would pull me back into those canyons one last time. The swell. For all its silence, wasn't quite finished speaking. A week after Lisa flew home, the wind changed again in the swell. The storms that sweep across that desert in late September always sound the same. Low thunder rolling like someone dragging furniture across the sky. I was back on the ridge that evening checking the new safety markers when I saw the first glint of bronze from the plaque they'd set into the rock. I hadn't planned to stop, but the light caught it just right, so I climbed down and brushed the sand off its face. Dr. James Chen, 1967-2012. Geologist, teacher, explorer. He loved these rocks. The words looked simple against the endless stone. You could feel the weight of them if you stood there long enough. I sat near the spot where they'd found him, the air cooling fast as the sun slipped behind the cliffs. It was the same color it must have been the day the cave sealed shut, a deep red that burns down to shadow. The sheriff had once told me that bad luck doesn't look like bad luck while it's happening. It looks ordinary. That's how it was for James. A moment of interest, a small sound of shifting rock, and suddenly the world changed around him. The medical examiner said he was probably alive for 2 days, maybe 3. Long enough to hope, long enough to write his last words. That thought doesn't leave you. Lisa called me the following month. She'd gotten the last of his personal effects back from the county, his watch, his notebook, the hammer that never left his hand. She said she'd placed it on her mantel next to a framed photo of him smiling in front of a canyon wall. It helps, she told me, not to remember how he died, but how he lived. She sounded steadier than before, like the weight of not knowing had finally lifted. Grief doesn't disappear. It just changes shape, and she'd found a way to hold it that didn't crush her. The university kept its promise. Every geology student now carries a satellite communicator, and every trip into the field follows strict check-ins. They named the updated safety protocol after him, and there's a scholarship that bears his name, too. I've met 2 of its recipients. Bright kids, one from Oregon, another from Arizona, both studying the same formations James once mapped. When they told me they wanted to follow in his footsteps, I told them not to. Not exactly. Learn from them, I said, but make your own path. The desert doesn't owe us anything, but it teaches what no classroom can. The 3 hikers who found him still come through Green River now and then. They've become almost like family to Lisa. Ryan sends her a postcard every August on the anniversary of that day, a photo of the canyon signed simply, "We found him." I think that's his way of telling her the story didn't end in darkness. Melissa once told me she still dreams about the cave, how she sometimes wakes up hearing the sound of loose rock shifting. But in the dream, she said, I always see light coming through like he made it out. Maybe that's her mind's way of fixing what can't be fixed. I don't blame her for it. For me, the story lingers in quieter ways. I still drive that road sometimes, the one that runs from town to the trailhead. There's a bend where the land opens up and you can see for 30 miles nothing but stone and air. That's where I usually stop the truck, step out, and listen. If the wind's right, you can almost hear it moving through the canyons like a low hum, steady patient. I think about how close we came to missing him forever. How for 12 years we walked past a sealed cave, never realizing a man was waiting just behind it. I think about what that says, not just about search and rescue, but about how we move through our own lives, how often we pass right by people carrying their own kind of weight, never knowing they're just inches from breaking through. The sheriff retired for good after the case closed. He told me once, "It's not the unsolved ones that stick with you, Dan. It's the ones you thought you'd solved only to learn you were standing on top of the truth the whole time." He wasn't bitter about it, just tired. We both were. The older I get, the more I realize that most of what we call answers are really just smaller mysteries we've learned to live with. When the official investigation files were sealed, they sent me a copy of James's final entries for the museum archives. I read them one last time before storing them away. The last page is smudged, his handwriting uneven. He writes about his family, his students, his work. Then near the bottom, a single line stands alone. I don't regret coming here. I've thought about that sentence more than any other. It isn't defiance, it's acceptance. He knew the risks, and still he chose to be where he felt most alive. That's something rare in this world. Every spring, geology students make a pilgrimage to the plaque. They leave small offerings, a compass, a field notebook, a tiny hammer charm. None of it stays long. The desert reclaims everything. But the intention lingers. I think James would have liked that. Not the ceremony of it, but the quiet acknowledgement that someone's life can mean something long after it's gone. A few months ago, I took my grandson out to that same ridge. He's 12, curious in that way kids are when the world still feels big. I told him about James, not the whole story, just the part about a man who studied rocks because he wanted to understand how the earth remembers. My grandson knelt, picked up a small red stone, and turned it in his hand. "Do you think he would have liked this one?" he asked. I told him, "Yeah, I think he would have." Then he placed it gently by the plaque, the way you might set down a prayer. Driving home that day, I realized something I hadn't before. Stories like this don't end when the last report is written or the plaque goes up. They end when the people left behind start to carry them forward, when the silence becomes remembrance, and remembrance becomes gratitude. James didn't die for nothing. His life changed how people move through this landscape, how they think about risk and respect. And maybe that's what legacy really is, not the echo of tragedy, but the quiet shift that comes after it. I still think about that final image sometimes, the cave sealed, the hammer still in his hand, the sunlight just out of reach. It's unbearable if you stop there, but that's not where it ends for me. I choose to picture the moment the canyon opened again, 12 years later, when light finally poured in, touching the place where he'd been waiting. That's the image I hold onto the earth, finally exhaling the story, stepping back into daylight. The San Rafael swell is still as wild as it's ever been. Tourists come and go, hikers chase sunsets across the mesas, and every so often a ranger or a student pauses near that bronze plaque. They stand quietly, maybe read the name, maybe don't. But I like to think the land remembers. That somewhere in all that stone and silence a part of him still lingers, steady, patient, unafraid. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, not for clicks, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark. Every story we remember is one more voice the desert can't take back.